Here are Daniel Naroditsky's greatest games, and he starts e4 in the first game against Magnus Carlsen, who replies g6, the modern defense. Daniel, also known as Danya, takes the full center, and black plays d6, making it easier to develop his knight by hindering e5. But after white's knight c3, and black c6 boxing out the knight, white goes ultra aggressive with f4, dominating the center and reinforcing a potential e5. Black switches things up with d5, inviting white to push his pawn, gaining space, hoping that he can later win the overextended pawns. Black follows with h5, advancing on the king side, and Danya carries on development. Black pins the knight, and white brings out his other bishop before black plays e6, opening up his king side. White develops his final minor piece, and black maneuvers his knight to h6, ready to get it to f5. White's a3 hits the bishop, but black counters with knight f5, hitting white's bishop, who drops to f2. Then black grabs the knight, and after white recaptures with his queen, black pushes h4, taking control over a weak g3 square. Now, before it can make any use of the g3 square, Danya decides to grab the knight, and after the recapture, he castles queenside. Black develops his other knight, and white bursts out with g4. Now, if allowed, he will take on f5, destroying black's pawn structure. So black takes en passant, and white recaptures with the bishop. Black turns the attention to the other end with b5, and Danya calmly shifts his king to safety on b1. Black advances his knight towards the queen side, and in anticipation of a pawn advance, white drops his knight. Black carries on with a5, and white, with a passed h-pawn, starts pushing it. Black jumps his knight forward, and Danya keeps pushing with h5. Black plays a4, and the h6 square is well defended, so white can't keep going. He instead drops his knight back, ready to reactivate it. Black breaks with c5 next, with the idea being that after white takes it, which he does, black can recapture, developing his bishop. But this gives white a semi-open d-file to work with. First, Danya activates his knight on d3 with a tempo on the bishop, who advances to e3. White tries to get rid of that bishop with his own bishop, and black defends it with his queen. Now, he wouldn't mind some exchanges because he is the side with less space. But after white takes the bishop and black recaptures, white drops his queen to g2, avoiding the queen's exchange and making use of the open g-file. And this next sequence of moves is nothing short of brilliant by Danya. Black lifts his king to e7, connecting his rooks, and white jumps his knight to b4, threatening a potential sacrifice on d5, with the rook staring at the enemy king. So black shifts his king to c7 so that any capture wouldn't come with check by the rook. But Danya takes anyway. Were black to take back, then knight takes d5 would be a royal fork. So black doesn't take it, instead sliding his rook all the way over to g8, hitting white's queen. And at this point, white has a remarkable way to win the game. Can you find the checkmate in 4? To find the move, you can notice that the powerful knight and queen duo would be enough to checkmate the black king. But white can't waste any time. He has to get his pieces involved by force. The move Danya plays to achieve this is the stunning rook sacrifice, rook d7 check. Now the king doesn't need to take the rook, but then queen to b7 check would either be checkmate had the king gone backwards, or in this case would give the king two options, either of which would be met by a checkmate by the knight. So, going back, black decides to take the rook, and white's queen jumps to b7 anyways. This gives the king two options. Were the king to go to d8, then knight c6 check, king to e8, and queen to e7 would be checkmate. So in the game, black moves his king to e8, but Danya finishes things up with queen c8 check, forcing king to e7, and knight c6 checkmate. A checkmate almost as good as the one that happens in the next game, as Danya meets the Sicilian defense with c3, the Alapin. Timur Taktumashev plays d5, since after white takes and black takes back with the queen, the white c-pawn is in the way of the knight who could have developed with tempo. Black instead fights for the center with d4, and black develops his knight to f6. White's knight f3 is followed by e6, opening his king bishop, and white jumps his knight to a3, looking to jump it forward on the queen side. Black develops his knight, and Danya develops his bishop, supporting his center. After black takes the pawn, white sneakily jumps his knight to b5, leaving his bishop alone because he's threatening knight c7 with a devastating royal fork. Black has no choice but to move his queen to safety, and white grabs the pawn with his knight. Black develops his bishop, and white grabs the knight, relieving some central tension. After the recapture, he develops his final minor piece, and both sides castle. Black drops his queen back a square in anticipation of the white knight potentially jumping forward. Danya sees this and moves his bishop to d4, ready to harass the queen in a different way. Black's b6, opening the square for his bishop, is followed by bishop to e5, kicking the queen back to d8. White moves his queen off the same line as the enemy queen, and black develops his bishop. Then, using the vacated square, Danya swiftly slides his rook over to d1, peering the queen, who shifts over a square. Then he centralizes his knight, opening up his queen towards the king side. And with all white's pieces pointed towards that side of the board, he's ready for the attack. At this moment, black slips up. His king is well defended for now, but he decides to drop his knight back to attack the bishop. But this mere moment is all it takes, as the knight leaves the king with one less defender. With h7 no longer defended, Danya follows with a stunning sacrifice. Bishop takes h7 check. Now black doesn't have to take the bishop, but white just got a free pawn and would have a very similar attack either way. So he takes the bishop, and white's queen jumps to h5 with check, forcing the king back to g8. And another stunning sacrifice comes next with bishop takes g7. The threat here is queen h8 checkmate, and while black could move his f-pawn to stop it, it would hang his e-pawn, and white would just win another pawn. So black takes the second bishop, and white checks with queen g4. Now the king has a few options, but no matter where he goes, in this case to h8, white's response is the same. He's gonna lift his rook to d3, ready to swing it over. And there just isn't really a good way for black to stop that. Black decides to jump his knight to f6 in order to block the check while also hitting the queen. Danya slides his rook over to h3 with a check, and the knight blocks it. Then Danya follows with a jaw-dropping move, one that leads to a checkmate in 6. Can you find it? Now to find the move, you can notice that white wants to play queen h5 and then take the knight with the checkmate. But black would play bishop e4, defending his knight. Danya sees this, and the move he plays is the brilliant and third sacrifice of the game, knight f5. This threatens a checkmate on g7, so black is forced to react, and it also blocks the diagonal that the bishop would use to defend the knight. Now, if black wanted to get the longest possible checkmate, he could take on c3, defending the g7 square, but that would be hopeless. Another move could be bishop f6 defending, but then white would play queen h5 with an unstoppable checkmate on h7, with black's bishop no longer able to defend. So in the game, black decides to take the knight, and white plays queen h5. Then the beauty of white's last move comes to light, since with the black pawn in the way, black still can't defend his knight. He could try to delay things with bishop h4, but that again would be hopeless. Instead, he moves his king to g7, trying to run it away. But Danya doesn't let him run with queen to h6, and at this point, black resigns the game. This is because the king is forced backwards, and it doesn't matter to which square, queen takes h7 would be checkmate. This leads us to our third opponent, Grandmaster Puramezanali, who meets d4 with d5 before Danya takes us into another Jobava London system. Black blocks white's bishop with his, and white plays e3 defending it while opening up his king side. Black carries on development, and after white develops his knight, black castles. Then white brings out his bishop to d3, staring at h7, and black finally takes white's bishop. White recaptures, and black plays a seemingly normal move, b6. But his best move would have been instead to play h6, stopping white's next move. Danya plays the brilliant bishop takes h7 check. Now black, again, as usual, doesn't have to take the pawn, but the continuation would be similar. So black takes it. White follows with knight g5 check, and going backwards will lose instantly to queen h5, after which the only way to stop queen h7 checkmate would be to move the rook to e8, which would allow queen takes f7. The king would go to the corner, and white would castle queenside before lifting his rook up and swinging it over. This attack would become devastating. Back to the game. So instead, black moves his king forward to stop queen h5. Danya plays queen d3 check, and black blocks it with his pawn. White castles queenside, and black shifts his king to f6, defending his pawn in anticipation of white's rook d1 piling up on it. Then black develops his knight, and white shifts his queen, adding another attacker to the pawn. Black adds a defender with his queen, and white jumps his knight to b5, trying to exploit the black queen being overworked, defending two pawns. Black, however, doesn't see any threat, so he moves his knight to g6, and Danya goes ahead, sacrificing his knight on c7. And now black should not take the knight, but white is hitting the rook in the corner and the e6 pawn several times. So he decides to take the knight, falling right into white's trap. He has a wonderful way to win here. Can you find the checkmate in 2? To find the move, you can notice that black's queen has very few squares to work with, and a rook on e6 or a queen would be checkmate. While Danya plays the crushing queen sacrifice, queen takes e6 check, and this is exactly what black missed as he resigns the game. The only move here would be taking the queen, after which rook takes e6 would be checkmate. The next opponent is Grandmaster Alexander Rustamov, and Danya takes us into another London system. Black's a6 stops the knight from jumping forward, and white plays e3, opening his kingside. Then black strikes in the center with c5. White takes it, and black swings his queen over to a5, going after the pawn. And white doesn't have a good way to defend it, since queen to d4, which would be the only move, would just be met by knight c6, after which the queen would have no way to defend the pawn. So instead, white lifts his queen only one square, and black wins back the pawn. Danya develops his knight, and after black opens his kingside with e6, he brings his bishop out. Black develops his bishop, and after white castles, black should probably follow suit, but he instead pushes b5, gaining space on the queen side. And after white plays a3 to stop an annoying b4, black can develop his bishop onto the opened up square. Danya centralizes his rook, and after black's knight b to d7, he bursts out with e4. Black takes the pawn, and this leads to a lot of trades in the center. Black does this so that after the dust settles, he can activate his knight with a tempo. But in return, white does get dominant control over the open d-file. Black then castles, and Danya puts his second rook on the d-file, creating a makeshift Alyoshin's gun. Black slides his rook over to the c-file, adding an attacker to c2. So white plays c3, saving the pawn. And black jumps his knight to d5, hitting the bishop. At this point, things start to get really interesting. Danya advances his bishop to e5, setting up a nasty trap. Black's best move here would be f6 to kick the bishop back, but that could weaken the e6 square. So instead, black tries fighting back for the d-file with his rook, and white grabs the g7 pawn with his bishop. This is so that after the king takes it, he can slide his rook over to g4 with check, and now black should and absolutely must play king to f8 here to survive. White would follow with queen h6, and from here there are several options and the game would go on. Instead of this, black decides to move his king to h8, and from this point, it's all Daniel Naroditsky. He jumps his knight to e5, threatening a checkmate with knight takes f7. Black defends it with his rook, and then the queen flies into h6, threatening another checkmate on g7. Black defends it again the only way that he can, and white grabs the knight, removing a key defender of the bishop, which, if taken by the queen, would be checkmate. This gives black no time to recapture the rook, as he has to drop his queen back to defend his bishop. Then Danya plays a breathtaking move, knight c6. Now that knight is completely hanging, But the queen is under attack, and she must keep eyes on the bishop to stop checkmate. This leaves black with no option but to accept the sacrifice and take the knight. And if you understood why white just played knight c6, then you will be able to find this wondrous winning combination. Can you find the checkmate in 2? The reason Danya moved his knight was for the sole reason of getting out of the way of his rook. Rook h5 would also work here, creating an unstoppable threat of checkmate on h7 next. But Danya adds a touch of flair with the crushing queen sacrifice, queen takes h7 check. Black is forced to take it, and rook h5 checkmate is an elegant ladder checkmate on the side of the board. Checkmate after checkmate, and the next game is no exception with Kanan Hajiev playing a Caro-Kann defense. Danya exchanges the pawns and both sides develop their knights before Danya pins it with his bishop. Black pins white's knight, and white plays the explosive c4. Black's a6 questions the bishop, who grabs the knight, and after black recaptures, then white swings his queen to a4, attacking the weak pawn. And black drops his bishop back to defend. Danya keeps the pressure with knight e5, and black calmly plays e6 because were white to take the pawn, then he'd put his knight into a pin, which black could exploit with queen c7, making that knight a goner. Instead of that, white pushes c5, taking some space, and black develops his knight to e7, staying out of the way of his f-pawn. This is so that after white's next move, which is bishop f4, he can play f6 to kick the knight back. Then he plays g6, hitting white's bishop. Danya drops it a square, and after black's h5 trying to hunt the bishop down, he plays h4, stopping the pawn from advancing any further. Black develops his bishop, and white's queen, having done her job on a4, drops to c2, hitting the now undefended knight. Black defends that with his king. Then white castles, and black shifts his queen, making way for his bishop to reroute. After white centralizes his rook, black drops his bishop. Danya follows with knight c3, and black offers a trade of bishops. White cleverly responds by slotting his bishop into d6. This does allow black to take the bishop, giving white a weak pawn after he recaptures, which black immediately targets with queen b8. But white jumps his knight to a4, after which, in return for the sacrificed pawn, white can jump his knight onto a powerful post on c5. Then, to prevent an annoying knight b7, black lifts his rook to defend the 7th rank. Danya also lifts his rook, preparing to double up on the weak e6 pawn. And black plays a5, probably trying to prevent b4, which would solidify white's knight. But white wasn't even planning that, as he swiftly slides his rook over to e1, threatening to take the e6 pawn. Black defends it with his rook, and white follows with the brilliant knight e5 check. Now, if this was taken by the pawn, then white would shift his rook over to f3 with a check, which would force either the king to move away from the knight's defense, or black could block with the knight, but then white would take the pawn with his rook, making it impossible for black to defend his pinned knight. Back to the game. So black takes the knight with his knight, and Danya takes back with his pawn, hitting both the queen and the king's cover. Black doesn't want to take with his pawn because it would just open up a path towards his king. So he drops his queen a square, and white snatches the pawn on f6. Black's queen is under attack, and he shouldn't take back with her because rook to f3 would be a pin. So black has no choice but to take with the pawn. This allows Danya's queen to swoop into h7 with a check that forces black's king to f8. Another check pushes him right back, where white can now take the pawn with check. The king drops back, and white sneakily slides his rook over to g3, weaving a subtle trap. Black is already completely lost, but if he wanted to save his king, he could play queen f7, giving the king a lane to run away. But the white knight is completely undefended here, so black bites the bullet and takes it. But this gives white one and only one winning move. Can you find the checkmate in 3? To find the move, you need to see that not only is black's king caught in a corner while white's pieces are primed for the attack, but the small detail that black can't defend the g8 square. Danya sees this, and the move he plays is queen h7. This gives black's king no free squares, and the unstoppable threat next is rook g8 checkmate. Black can't stop that, so he resigns. But if he really wanted to delay things, he could grab the pawn on f2 with check. Then, no matter what his next move would be, rook g8 would be checkmate. The next opponent is Grandmaster Alexander Donchenko, and Danya takes us into a fantasy Caro-Kann defense after f3. Black plays e6, solidifying his center, and white pressures it with knight c3. The bishop pins the knight, and white immediately asks it the question with a3. It takes the knight, damaging white's pawn structure after he recaptures. Then black takes on e4, and white plays an aggressive knight h3. This would allow black to take the pawn, but then white would be able to recapture with the queen and get a quick attack on the king side. In light of this, black avoids capturing, instead going for knight f6 developing. Danya now takes the pawn on e4, and were black to take it back with his knights, then white would be able to play queen g4, forking the knight and the pawn on g7. So instead of taking it, he pushes e5, wanting white to take the pawn so that he could exchange queens before winning back the pawn on e4. That doesn't happen, however, with white instead dropping his knight back to f2 to defend his center. After black castles, he develops his bishop, looking to do the same. Black develops his knight, and white castles before black shifts his rook to what could soon be a semi-open e-file. Danya lifts his queen, and so does black, putting pressure on the weak c-pawn. White lets it go with knight g4, hitting black's knight, and after black takes the pawn, white advances his bishop to g5, adding yet another attacker to that knight. Still, black is able to take another pawn in the center with a check, and after the king dodges, black drops his queen to d6, defending his knight. Danya goes for bishop c4 next, and pretty much no matter what black plays, white's going to slide his rook over to d1, hitting the queen. In anticipation, black lifts his queen to d4, attacking the bishop. But white bursts out with the brilliant bishop takes f7. White's forking the king and the rook, so black is forced to accept the sacrifice, walking right into a potent pin. Danya takes once on f6, and black takes back with the pawn. Then white swings his rook over, hitting the queen, who sidesteps to c4. And at this point, everything has fallen into place, and white has a beautiful winning combination. Can you find the checkmate in 4? To find the move, you can notice that the white queen and knight would do numbers on the black king, but the knight is defending this pawn, so it would be hard to get at him. So Danya plays the winning move, rook takes d7, removing the defender of that pawn. To get the longest checkmate here, black would have to play king to g8, after which knight h6 check would force either king h8, which would lead to queen f6 checkmate immediately, or king to f8, after which queen to f6 would force black to block with the queen, and queen takes f7 would be checkmate. Going back, in the game, instead of that, black takes the rook, and white takes the pawn on f6 with check, forcing the king back to g8. Then, knight h6 is an aesthetic checkmate. This leads us to our penultimate opponent, Grandmaster Etienne Bracrot, who plays a Sicilian defense, to which Danya responds with a Rosolimo, making use of the open diagonal to give check. Black blocks with his knight, and after white castles, he pushes a6, kicking the bishop back to d3. Black develops his other knight, and white centralizes his rook before black plays e6, opening his kingside. Danya decides now to drop his bishop back, and after black develops his bishop, he plays c3, preparing a pawn break in the center. b5, expanding on the kingside by black, is met by d4, fighting for the center. Black moves his bishop to b7, adding an attacker to the e4 pawn, which white defends with bishop d3. Then black castles, and white develops his other knight before black takes in the center. White recaptures, getting a powerful central pawn duo, but black gets rook to c8 with full control over the open c-file. Danya drops his knight, planning a maneuver towards the kingside. Then black plays e5, trying to contest white's center. He wouldn't mind here if white pushes his pawn, because the closed center means that black could focus his attention on the king's side. Instead of that, white decides to maintain the tension with knight g3, and black centralizes his rook on e8. Then white plays a4, adding an attacker to the b5 pawn. So black takes on a4, and white recaptures with the rook, putting pressure on the a6 pawn. Then black takes on d4, and white decides to forget about the a pawn, recapturing with the rook to pressure black's vulnerable d pawn. In anticipation of white's knight f5, adding more pressure to the pawn while hitting the bishop, black drops his bishop, and Danya goes for knight f5. Black plays queen b6, defending his pawn while hitting the rook, so white moves his bishop, opening his queen's defense of the pawn. This, however, is a small mistake because it does allow black to snatch the e-pawn. He decides instead to not take the pawn, playing d5, and white takes the pawn, opening up the e-file. The rooks are exchanged, and then black plays g6, kicking back the white knight. But Danya doesn't retreat, with knight h6 check. The king dodges, and then white lifts his bishop to e3, peering the enemy queen. Black slots his bishop into c5, counterattacking. Now, since white has to move his rook, and the bishops will shortly be exchanged, and maybe the queens too, the knight would be undefended after all of it. So white just takes the pawn on f7, at least winning a pawn for the knight he's about to lose. Black takes it, thinking white's now gonna move his rook, but he doesn't. Danya plays the brilliant bishop h6, taking even more squares away from the black king. Now black's best move here would be queen d6 to blockade the d-pawn and prevent any discovered checks. But white would follow with queen e6 check, forcing the exchange of queens since black's king would have nowhere to go. And after the exchange, white would take back with the pawn and forking the king and knight to win back the piece. Going back, instead of this, black decides to take the rook. This allows white to push his pawn, and even though this bishop is hanging, black shouldn't take it because of queen e7 forcing the king to g8 and queen g7 checkmate. So instead of that, black is pretty much forced to block this check with his knight. And at this point, it's all over. Can you find white's checkmate in 6? White has a queen, knight, and bishop ready to attack a stranded king with all of its allies on the other end of the board. The move Danya starts with is knight g5 check. This gives the black king two options. King to f6 would be met by queen e6 checkmate. So the black king is forced to back up to g8, where he's about to get slaughtered. Queen e6 check forces him to the corner, and knight f6 check pushes him right back. Knight d8 is check again, and the king runs right back before queen e8 is played, and black resigns. The only move here would be knight f8 blocking, and queen takes f8 would be checkmate. And their final opponent is Aptin Atakan, and Danya takes us into a Jobava London system. After black's e6, he goes after the c7 point with knight b5, where a fork would be brutal. So black defends it with knight a6, and after white plays e3 opening his king's side, black develops his bishop, and white develops his knight before black castles. And at the exact moment that black commits to the king's side, Danya hauls out h4, gaining a foothold over the king's side. After bishop d7, he keeps going with h5. Black finally stops further advances with h6, and white jumps his knight forward to e5, where it hits the black bishop. Black drops it a square, and white backs up his other knight, turning its attention back towards the center. Black then breaks with c5, and white doesn't react as he storms through on the other end with g4. Now, to stop an irritating g5, black quickly drops his knight back, fighting for that square. And Danya leaps his bishop to d3, trying to swipe a defender off the king's side. After black's knight b4 hitting the bishop, the white bishop rushes to grab the knight and the king recaptures. Then white plays a3, kicking black's knight back to c6. Danya shifts his rook a square, reinforcing the idea of pawn to g5. But it's defended enough for now, so black takes in the center, and after white recaptures, he plays queen b6, not only piling up on the weak d-pawn, but attacking b2. White inserts queen d3 check, getting the queen out of the way so that after the king dodges, he can castle the king, which defends the pawn, and uses his rook to add a defender to the d-pawn. Now black really doesn't want to allow g5 here by white, so he first takes white's knight. Now white taking with the pawn would allow black to take on f2, so white takes it back with the bishop, and this allows black to play f6 with a tempo, kicking the bishop back while making it very difficult for white to push g5. Black follows with rook c8, peering the enemy king, and white slides his rook over from g to e1, pressuring the now soft e6 pawn. Black defends that pawn with his bishop, and Danya plays a sweet sacrifice here to win a pawn. Knight takes d5, and after the recapture, he wins back the piece, namely the bishop on e7. Black shifts his queen next, creating a lingering, irritating threat of checkmate on c2. But it's no problem for white with his queen defending, as he doubles up on the open e-file. Black shifts his rook, giving up his bishop, but white shouldn't take it because he would lose the rook behind it. So going back, Danya instead jumps his queen to f5, approaching the enemy king side, and black shifts his king over to defend his bishop. White follows with the sneaky rook 1 to e6, hitting the queen, and here black should actually take the rook not with his bishop, but with his queen, because he would get 2 rooks for the queen, which is a fairly equal exchange. Instead of that, black decides to take the sacrificed rook with his bishop, and falls right into Danya's trap. There's one and only one winning move here. Can you find the checkmate in 4? When black moved his bishop, the white rook's eyes opened up, and with the black rook and bishop taking escape squares away from the black king, it's pretty much all over. The move Danya plays to win the game is the stunning sacrifice, rook takes g7 check. Now black doesn't have to take it, but going to the corner would see queen h7 checkmate, and going to f8 would see queen takes f6, forcing the bishop to block, and queen takes f7 checkmate. So, black accepts the sacrifice, taking the rook, and white plays another brilliant sacrifice, bishop takes h6 check. Black can't take that one because of queen g6 checkmate. And going backwards, doesn't matter which square, would lead to very similar checkmates. So, in the game, black moves his king to f7, thinking he's avoided all of the checkmates. But with his own pieces in its way, white can deliver the knockout blow, queen h7 checkmate.